As you step into the narrow corridor, a swift, brisk wind snuffs out your torch. The same chill bites through your armor, your clothes, nipping at your very soul. Before your eyes can adjust to the dark, dozens of sconces placed on the walls to either side of you light up with a green, malevolent blaze, guiding the path towards your doom. At the end of this path, you see the greatest flame of all, a bonfire made of burning bones. Before it stands a creature the likes of which is only reserved for nightmares and stories used to terrify naughty children. Withered, greyed flesh clings to yellow bone, claws as long and as sharp as daggers dangle loosely at its sides as it arches its back unnaturally to greet the intruders to its lair. Hollow eyes burn holes into your soul as it gazes upon you, its mouth hanging open, dripping blood. Just as you draw your weapon, ready yourself to face this unholy creature, you whisper a short prayer to whatever god will listen, hoping that if death should meet you this day, that it will at least be a swift one. And from there, you know what happens next. Roll initiative, the big bad shows off its powerful skills, summons a few minions, and likely goes down after a few action-packed rounds of combat. Maybe a player character dies, maybe they all make it out by the skin of their teeth, but either way, they'll have had a fight to remember. But if you want to make them remember not just the time they almost died, but the character who made them come as close with death as they ever have, then listen close, as today I'll do my best to give you a guide on making great villains in Dungeons & Dragons. In the last video, we looked at NPCs, the characters that don't always need to stand out in your campaign, but ideally should if you want the players to feel that much more connected to the world and story they're in. Also, if you want them to care about anyone else besides their party, it's good to have three-dimensional helpers here and there. Looking at hostile NPCs or villains though, these are the real key pieces of any campaign. They are the obstacles your heroes are set to overcome, the immovable object against their unstoppable force, a clash that is destined to happen and one that should have the players hyped whenever you pull out that boss encounter map or use the devilish voice you've saved for the big bad. It's important to distinguish as well here that when I'm talking villains, I'm not thinking about the random hag the party stumble upon when they try and take shelter in her hut. That's just a random encounter and isn't meant to be something that your players will necessarily cling onto. Knowing how D&D often works though, your evil half-lich, half-demon that you've set up for about 20 sessions will be forgotten in an instant compared to Harriet the hag, who stood out because of a catchphrase you came up with for her on the fly. To avoid an incident like that, I'm going to go through how I build up and make effective villains. With over a decade of DMing and plenty of campaigns and villains under my belt, I feel like I've figured out what works and what doesn't when it comes to making a villain matter, both in terms of the smaller scale villains you get at the start of a campaign and the world-ending god-eaters your party will face at level 20. If you've watched my video on NPCs, you'll be familiar with this first tip, and while it might sound obvious, it's important to make sure your villain feels like a character first and a plot device second. A villain is a plot device in D&D at the end of the day. They are a thing that you put in the game to give your players an obstacle to their overall goal. They can't save the land, kingdom, or world without someone threatening it, after all. Yet, you want to disguise that as much as possible by bringing this villain to life, by making them feel like a person who exists. The way you do that? Well, you build them like a player character. In terms of story, I mean, not stats. When drawing up this villain, you'll want to ask questions of yourself and them. Who were they before the events of the campaign? If they are an ancient lich who has just been awoken once more, you still can have a backstory for them. What led to them becoming that lich? Is the world different from what it was back then, and would they like to go back to that world? You also need to track down their motivations, which act as their present goal. It can be as simple as destroying the world for the sake of it. In one of my campaigns at the moment, the main villain wishes to eradicate all humanoid life because he finds them to be far too cruel and self-interested, believing they will lead to the destruction of all that is beautiful. But you can also have more intricate motivations, like killing a lot of people to bring back a loved one, or gathering pieces of a lost artifact to end a curse on themselves. You'll just have to be careful not to make them too sympathetic, unless that is you're looking for a friendship ending to your campaign, like Critical Role Season 2 for example. You'll also want to ideally plot out their plans for after they accomplish this major goal, but I think something else that you have to take into account with a villain, more so than where they want to be after they've completed their grand plan, is their flaw. You'll first detail their plan and why it should make sense in their head, but it shouldn't be flawless, otherwise it would be too tempting for the heroes to join in. If your villain thinks they're ending the world but they're just giving everyone free puppies and kittens, then what's the point? Your villain can want total world domination, total destruction, but their plan should have one weakness. Not a plot hole or something that makes them look stupid, like a key fact they've refused to acknowledge, but something they've chosen to ignore. For example, let's say a vampire wants to give his kind the ability to walk in the daylight, so that they may rule the world and feast whenever they please, but they refuse to believe that this world would lead to vampires only being more persecuted and hunted down by the mortals who vastly outnumber them. Why would a vampire ignore this fact? Well, because he has a massive ego and thinks that vampires are the best, so he doesn't think any pitiful humans could hunt him down with wood and stab him in the chest. So, when you sit down and take a look at your villain, you need to have their past set out, which will give them a reason to commit whatever evil act they have planned ahead, and perhaps a goal or vision for the world they want to see come to life. You need to ask why they think it's a good idea to do what they wish to do, but you can't make that plan flawless. I think Thanos is a great example to draw on here, as his plan of killing half the universe is the only solution to him because of his harsh past and his life experience. However, it isn't actually the only way to prevent destruction. If you can answer these questions above, you've already got half the job done in making your villain a compelling character. As was the case with NPCs, the work you're doing here is to create the idea that there is a great depth to this character, and even though your players may never ask what their favourite colour is, you should have an answer prepared just in case. Those questions are mainly your outline though. They'll make your villain a character, but they don't give them that perfect, incredible villain status. To do that, you'll have to go the extra mile, and there are a few ways to go about that. I found one of the strongest ways to do this is to connect the villain to your party. Your party are the stars of the show, the protagonists of this story, and so it makes sense that your antagonist is comparable to them. Perhaps this is through a connection to a player backstory. Someone that burned down a player's home village has come again to try and ruin the town they're staying in. That's a surefire way to open up a bit of interesting roleplay and get at least one player interested in an arc, but I find if you want to make a villain as strong on their own, without leaning on a player backstory, your best bet is to have them act as a twisted mirror to the party. As they play, study your players' quirks, how they approach the encounters and problems you set for them. If they really relish their revenge against monsters that have done a lot of damage to them, give the villain even more of a vengeance-oriented motivation, showing them the darker path they could have walked had they not been the heroes of this tale. If they have made friends with lots of people along the road, your villain could be someone betrayed by anyone he's ever trusted. As I said, it's holding up a twisted mirror to your party, as the antagonist should be the antithesis of the protagonist, but could also share some similar qualities. Mimicking this, as the DM, you can also think about what kind of villain your world would create. Is it a war-torn land that has never seen peace, and the villain decides it's simply time to wipe both sides from the world? Is it a peaceful place, but one that was once under threat from a dark, forgotten entity? Even if it's a perfect land full of sunshine, your villain could simply get bored of too much good stuff. Rooting your villain in the vision for your world while also making them a counter to the party in one way or another allows them to feel unique even if their motivations and past aren't. While I am loath to draw on Critical Role for inspiration, not because it's bad by the way, but just because I think people have already drawn on it enough, I think Vecna is a very, very good example to look at here. Mr. Mercer does a very good job at not only keeping Vecna as an imposing presence throughout Campaign 1, but he also manages to throw the players' rashness back at them by having them kill their former allies and friends who've been kidnapped by the god of the undead. It's something that doesn't set the DM against the player, but it does show that the villain has been studying them, learning their strengths and weaknesses, and is willing to go to any measures not just to break them physically, but mentally too. If you want another example and another popular D&D thing for me to draw on again, I think Ketheric, Orin and Gortash in Baldur's Gate 3 also all embody different aspects of where the party and player character could have gone in their desperation to free themselves from the Elder Brain. This leads me onto another major point to make your villains great, and that's have them be present. This is as much true for the big bads as it is for the villains of specific arcs. In the beginning, a simple throwaway use of a name is enough. Then, as time goes on, and this figure is revealed more, either personally or through more information given by other characters and places, the party will start to piece together the puzzle of this person. Again, Vecna comes to mind here, but one of the reasons why Strahd is such a memorable villain is that in the campaign he shows up, tells the party they're going to die, then leaves. You'll want to make sure it makes sense for your villain to show up and throw some insults at the party, but so long as it does, there's no reason not to let the party and your villain build up a rapport and hate each other even more. Think about all the great villains you know, from books, movies, games, TV, and even other D&D campaigns. Very few of them can make an impact without screen time, and so in your campaign, the only way you can give them screen time is by giving them moments when they appear in front of your players. They can get to know and hopefully hate or even sympathise with the villain the more they see them. You can do this in a few ways. There's the Strahd strategy, where your bad guy comes in to have a little gloat, but there's also what I like to call the parasite method, where you implant the villain early on into an arc or even the campaign. They may appear as an advisor to the party, a salesman, an innkeep. They might not even know they're the villain yet, but they're naturally inclined to hate or grow to hate the party. Over time they'll reveal themselves, perhaps in betrayal, or perhaps when they themselves feel betrayed by your players. I find that you can't use these villains in every arc, and sometimes they might not work over the years you'll put into a long campaign, but if you can pull this off using the knowledge of your party and world to know what kind of character might turn against them over time, sapping their strength and their trust, you'll create an adversary they won't forget, even if they're not the strongest foe. To make your villain memorable, you need to do more than just have them appear though. They should be working towards their goal often, which means they have to do stuff. Are they also on the hunt for a series of artifacts that can open a gateway to heaven and hell? Well, then they should be at some of the locations to get those pieces, or their underlings should be. And your villain can't just lose all these encounters either. No one takes a loser seriously in any media, and so when I say your villain does stuff, I really mean they need to do something that matters. They need to take steps towards a goal that matters. Do I mean they should TPK your party constantly? No, but while this might be controversial to some, I do think players should sometimes take an L. That might be something as simple as an NPC death that doesn't really affect them at all in terms of gameplay, or it could be a player death because they chose to stay and fight, even though you did warn them they might be outmatched. Calling back to my point on the world being a living, breathing space, this means that there are characters stronger than your party. There are gods that can wish them away in an instant, but we don't have those guys as enemies because it would be boring. Still, the point stands that you can have your players feel the wrath of a villain, just not in the final encounter. Heroes are forged by trials and tribulations, and so while it may sound obvious that your villain should be the cause of a lot of these trials, it's important to reiterate they can't just be made by an intimidating voice and a backstory your players may never care about. I'd say that you don't even need a villain with a tragic or relatable past to make them memorable. Sure, it helps to have them come across as more of a three-dimensional character, but as Alfred Pennyworth once said, "Sad men just want to watch the world burn." You've got to be careful with these guys, but so long as that you're not cheap and you put in the effort to make the motivations make sense, or manage to pull them off being crazy enough to the point where they don't have to make sense, it'll work. It might be hard to picture what I'm thinking of here, but the example I'd use is Eredin from the Witcher novels and the third game. Eredin doesn't really have a tragic backstory. He doesn't have a relatable reason to want power. Not really. He just sees the only means of survival as to conquer, and so he's willing to do whatever it takes to do that. His goal is more power, and that puts him on a direct collision course with our protagonists because he needs Ciri in order to have the ultimate form of power. Now, you may point out that Eredin isn't as effective as Letho of Gullet as a villain in the Witcher games, but I wouldn't say that's because of Letho's backstory or anything like that. I think instead it harkens back to two of my other points. Letho does more stuff and shows up more often, so you feel more connected to him as an adversary. So, if I'm going to try and sum up all the points I've made in this rambling mess, how would I go about it? Well, I'd start by saying you need to treat your villain as a person more than a plot device, weaving them into the plot via a connection to your characters and world. Then you need to figure out their past, but more importantly make sense of their motivations while also giving them a reason that they should fail. This isn't your edgy novel where the villain wins, and at the end of the campaign 9 times out of 10 they should lose. Study what works, but try not to copy it, as your players will smell a Vecna clone like an eggy fart, and ensure a stable connection between your villain and party so they feel like they're on a collision course, more that they're the bad guy that will show up at the end of the campaign because there just has to be one. Follow all that, and don't forget your villain can be intimidating without using cheap one-shot kills on an underleveled party, and you're off to the races. Thank you so much if you've made it this far. A like, subscription, comment all goes a long way for this channel. And if you've got any other things you want me to make tips for, let me know. Until then, I'll be seeing you, ghouls and gals.